Hello, hi. My name is Sophie Meunier. I'm the acting director of the European Union program this year at Princeton. And on behalf of the Woodrow School, I'm delighted to welcome Ambassador Vimont to our public lecture series. Mr. Pierre Vimont was named French ambassador to the United States in August by President Sarkozy. He replaced the departing Ambassador Levitt, who came to Princeton several times. I'm sure several of you got the opportunity to meet him, who went back to Paris to become sort of the equivalent of, not exactly, but the National Security Advisor or something like that. Ambassador Vimont, prior to being in the United States, was the chief of staff for the past 3 foreign ministers of France, and that includes the famous, or maybe we should say on this side of the Atlantic, the infamous Dominique de Villepin. And I've noticed that in his long and distinguished career, a couple of years which may have been particularly exciting were the years when you were at the permanent representation of France in Brussels from 86 to 1990, which was right the time which today we refer to as the relaunching of Europe and the single market program. So those must have been exciting years. Ambassador Vimont is a graduate of Sciences Po in Paris, which is also my alma mater, and the prestigious École Nationale d'Administration. And he will give a talk today on the role of diplomacy in today's world, after which we'll open it up for questions, and you're welcome to ask questions about the talk and, of course, as well, about the recent developments in French-American relations. This is Ambassador Vimont's first visit to Princeton, but I hope that the discussion with the students, the faculty, and the large French community in Princeton will be stimulating enough that you will have a chance, an opportunity, and a desire to come back soon. So thanks for coming.
Thank you very much, Sophie, and thank you, all of you, to welcome me in Princeton. It's the first time, in fact, that I come in the microphone, so that I was trying to avoid being recorded, but anyway, I have to get through that. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I apologize for being, first of all, French and for being diplomat. Nobody's perfect, but I'll try to do my best. I had decided, and I still intend to go on with discussing about diplomacy and the role of diplomacy in today's world. But of course, I'm quite prepared, first of all, to give you an intervention that could be as lively as possible, first of all. And then, of course, when I answer your questions, and I'm quite prepared to do that, I'm ready to go into any topic that you would wish to raise, of course. My intention was to try to be as close to the actual international life, because I think this is maybe what could be the most interesting. Why have I decided to use that topic? It seems to me because it's not only, I would say, for selfish interest and to try to promote my trade, diplomatic trade, but because I think that maybe as time goes on and as we look at the international affairs, one may think that military action has taken over quite often on diplomatic action. And my thesis, what I would like to say to you today, is to try to convince you that more than ever, I think diplomacy, in fact, is needed, because the reality of the international world requires that. But maybe, of course, that diplomatic action needs to be adapted to those new realities. The main reality being, of course, the global world in which we are living, where everything is interrelated more and more. And if you look at international affairs today, political issues, economic, social, cultural issues are totally interrelated, which means that the kind of diplomatic action that we have to get through today is quite different, of course, from the one we were dealing with a few years ago. Furthermore, and not only with those issues, but if you look, for instance, at an issue like terrorism, and I will come back to that in a few minutes, more and more you discover that when you have, let's say, a terrorist action taking place in Iraq or in Afghanistan, very soon after that, some of these consequences, some of these implications will appear far away from there, somewhere in Africa, in Europe, or even in other countries, in Indonesia, etc. The whole thing is so much interrelated today that really we have to take that into action. But first of all, let me go back to what I said at the beginning. The impression could be that, in fact, contrary to what I'm trying to state, that diplomatic action is more and more out of fashion, in fact. Let me just give you a few examples. Military intervention has, of course, multiplied in the recent years. And I'm not talking about those actions like the Russians intervening in Chechnya or what's been happening recently in Darfur or in Chad. I'm talking about decisions taken by the international community as such that has decided to set aside diplomatic traditional tools and to go for military action. Let's take, for instance, three recent examples. The intervention in Kosovo in 1999, the intervention in Afghanistan at the end of 2001, beginning of 2002, after the 9/11 here in your country, or even this will be maybe more of a controversy, but we can go into that also, the Iraq intervention by your country and a few other members of the international coalition that has gone to Iraq. What is interesting with all those cases is that after having negotiations, after having tried the diplomatic path, whether it be in the Security Council or whether it be outside the Security Council, but through different instances of the international world, in the end, the decision was taken that the only way to get forward was to go through a military intervention. Kosovo is the best example. We had several meetings taking place at the Security Council, the Russians intervening and stopping and putting their opposition to any kind of declaration or statement or resolution that we're going to get through. And in the end, a decision by some members of the international community who decide on their own that it was necessary to go ahead. And Kosovo has been going on since then with the same kind of military intervention that was thought necessary. And if you look on the other case where you have, and I'll come back to that later on also, if you look at other cases, Zimbabwe or Cuba, where we haven't decided to go through military action, and we have decided to resort to a diplomatic intervention. There, as we can see very easily, Zimbabwe or Cuba, nothing has really changed at the moment, whether it be President Mugabe or the communist regime in Cuba. Diplomatic intervention, diplomatic means have been unable to come to any kind of result. So this impression that the diplomatic course is not able today to give any real, concrete, tangible result is something that is slowly undermining, I would say, our international way of looking at the different issues. Second example that I can give you, of course, everything that has to deal with terrorism. Whether it be in violent areas like Iraq or Afghanistan, whether you look at the question, for instance, of hostages in Colombia, whether you look at what has happened in your country with 9/11, more and more people tend to think, this is what your present administration is saying, that the only way to fight terrorism is to go through war on terrorism. The way to deal with terrorism is to think about actions like counterinsurgency action in a country like Pakistan. It deals a lot, for instance, it has to do in Colombia in dealing with the hostage problem with the war that has been launched by President Uribe, who goes on saying that he thinks that the only way to solve that problem is in fact to go on fighting the FARC in all the areas of that country. And it could also, to a large extent, have a lot to do also with this quite controversial issue about renditions, Guantanamo, Abu Ghraib, etc., which is, if we want to fight terrorism, we have to use means that are not the traditional ones and the legal ones that are adopted by the international community, but we have to go to find other ways of dealing with that. So this is a second example. A third example we could give is that in, I would say, maybe less controversial issues, like the trade negotiation, the Doha cycle, or, for instance, more traditional diplomatic negotiations that have been going on for many years, negotiation that we've been trying to put through in the Middle East, Israel and the Palestinians on the other side. There is also this impression that our diplomatic means have not been able to solve those issues. Doha cycle is a very interesting one, as we go on finding more and more that the different aspects of those negotiations, which have not only to deal with the exchange, the trade exchange of products or services, but also to deal with direct investments, with the question of competition, the rules of competition, that have to deal with the rules about non-market aspects of international trade. More and more the impression is that this new cycle of trade negotiation is unable to get all the people agreed on one set of rules. This negotiation has been going on now for nearly 4 or 5 years without any real result. A new impulse is being given in the recent days without any real success, and the impression is growing up that in fact maybe those problems are impossible to solve on a multilateral basis, and that we maybe should rather go for bilateral solutions or regional solutions, but that the traditional diplomatic way of looking at the international trade negotiation has gone out of impetus and of momentum nowadays. So this could be, in a way, an assessment that could be made. I don't think it is the case, and this is what I want to tell you now. I think that more than ever, in fact, diplomacy is needed to solve those different problems, and I want to share with you some of my ideas on that principle. If you look, for instance, at the kind of wars and conflicts and military actions that have been launched, take for instance Afghanistan, let's stick to that. What we are seeing today, in fact, is even if we think we have done everything the proper way, the right way that should have been done, we're discovering that the kind of war we are fighting in Afghanistan brings about some very new issues that we can only deal with through diplomatic means, it seems to me. We have tried to do it the proper way. We have launched a military intervention with the support of all the international community. There was a resolution by the Security Council. There was an agreement inside NATO, as it was a NATO intervention based on Article 5 of the NATO Treaty. There has been also the whole political dimension that has been looked at. We had negotiations taking place in Germany in order to set up rule of law in Afghanistan. We have everybody has agreed, and the Afghans also, on a new regime. There has been a presidential election. There has been a government that has been named. And even if we have done all that, we find ourselves today at a difficult crossroads, where even the military actions that we may have taken on from a tactical point of view have been maybe successful, but haven't solved the issue. We are confronted to a situation when, as we go on more and more deeper into that country, the population has the impression that this foreign intervention is a sort of occupation army that they don't want anymore. We haven't solved the development problems of that country. President Karzai is a president with very little influence over the whole different regions of the area. And more what we are saying, all of us who are there, is that even if we reinforce and strengthen our military presence there, this will not solve the problem because we're lacking some sort of global strategy to help that country to get out. And when we talked about global strategy, it has a lot to do with the kind of relationship we get with the different leaders of the different tribes in the different areas of Afghanistan. That has a lot to do with the kind of development we would like to get into that country. It has a lot to do also with the poppy culture, the drug production going on and increasing in that country. And therefore we find more and more after 7 or 8 years being there that we lack a global strategy, and we lack in fact a clear discussion between the Afghans and the different countries that are there with their military resources, and that we lack, it seems to me, a clear diplomatic approach that has been maybe missing for some time. The main question being, in the end, why are we there? What is the objectives we're trying to get out of this situation? And how do we go on with the agreement and the support of the Afghans themselves? So be it for the Afghan intervention. We can feel that there is a real need for diplomatic action there. Terrorism, and without trying at all to excuse what is totally inexcusable, I think with terrorism we find ourselves confronted to more or less the same kind of challenge. If we want to fight terrorism, we have to look at really what are the motives behind terrorism. And as we go on and on trying to fight terrorism through the military means and intelligence, etc., we find out that we're never really able to get rid of it. If we manage, as some real success has been going on in Iraq for the past few months, thanks to the search policy and also the way the American military people have managed to equip some of the Sunnite community members in order to have them contribute to fighting Al-Qaeda in Iraq. The result is that more and more we see this terrorist movement going out of Iraq and finding another place where it can play a bigger part. And we have been fearing that for some time, and we're seeing it at the moment, that this terrorism is spreading over North Africa, in the whole Sahel fringe from Sudan right up to Mauritania, and that we are facing now a new challenge there, which means that we haven't still got the answer, the right answer and the right proper answer, which must be a political answer, in my opinion, to the terrorist movement. And if we want to go against that, maybe we have to look a little bit more closely to what's happening in the Muslim world, and to try to understand a better way what kind of frustration, humiliation is at the core, at the heart of that terrorist movement, and maybe to start looking at maybe what could be done, and to try to make a difference between some of the moderates inside those Muslim movements and some of the more radical elements of those Muslim movements, to see if we can try to find a way between the two of them. When I'm talking about Muslim movement, I'm thinking about the Hezbollah, I'm thinking about the Hamas, I'm thinking about precisely some of the Sunnis in Iraq, and some of the people that are also there in Afghanistan. If you look at the Taliban, maybe you discovered that maybe some are more moderates than others, and that there's maybe there some room for maneuver and some way to go ahead in order to make a difference between the two. I think this is very important because that tells a lot. That is, could be a very helpful way and a very helpful path in order to try to, I wouldn't say get rid, this will take a long time, but at least to try to reduce the pressure of terrorist movement at the moment, and I think this is also very important. A third example I could give to you is the question, of course, of human rights and of leaders in some of the third world countries, I'm thinking once again about Zimbabwe or Cuba, to try to understand in a better way what kind of action we could take, even if at the moment, through sanctions, through blockades, to embargoes. We have tried for many years to try to get rid of those regimes without succeeding. It seems to me that there also one has to reflect a little bit more about what's going on in the region around those countries. Let me give you just one example, Zimbabwe and President Mugabe. What has been very interesting in the last 5 or 6 years is that under the influence of Great Britain, we have tried as a European community to take sanctions and very strong actions against Zimbabwe. And what we have discovered time and again while we were discussing with the African countries is that they were not at all in agreement with us on those kind of actions. And that as long as we couldn't get the solidarity of the African countries in the actions we were taking against President Mugabe, there was very little hope that we would succeed in any way in having those sanctions and those actions being in any way efficient. And so there is a clear appeal there for more diplomatic negotiations, more diplomatic dialogue with African countries if we want to get them on board with us and to try to get a more global action against Zimbabwe, because otherwise there is very little hope that we will get any success in the end. Those were some of the examples I wanted to give you on the what seems to me to be more than ever the need for a diplomatic action. But then maybe I will have to be more precise, and that will be my last point I wanted to put to you before answering and starting to answer your question, is that one has to be also aware, and being a diplomat, I think more than everybody else, I have to be aware that if we want a diplomatic action to be active and more efficient than it has been in the past, we really need to look at the whole methods, tools, and principles of the diplomatic action that has been going on in the past, to review that and to adapt it to the reality of today. Let's look at the principles, for instance, and you are certainly aware of that. Of course, we have to confirm once again some of the principles that have been there in the international community for many years. Principle of sovereignty for each independent state, the principle of rule of law, of course, but I think we have to go also for more new principles that maybe there were in the past. The need maybe for more tolerance and for increased dialogue, if we want, with some of those countries, and also to push forward some of the new principles that have been recently set up by the Security Council in the United Nations, and also supported by the General Assembly of the United Nations. Notably, the right for protection, and we know that this has a lot to do with the decision that was taken about 10 years ago by the Security Council and the General Assembly to go for, in order to protect human rights, to go for a right of interference, the right to get inside a country if necessary, if that country doesn't abide by the general principles with regard to human rights. And I think that that has to be implemented more and more, and that we have to be prepared to do that more if needed. Mind you, this is exactly what's happening at the moment with Kosovo. As you know, that we have decided to go along with the independence of Kosovo, an independence that will not be ratified by a resolution of the Security Council in legal terms, but we think that this is the normal way of going since 1999, as we have set up a sort of a United Nations mandate on Kosovo, that we have tried to see if we could get an agreement with the Serbs on the way we could deal with the Kosovo issue. And as we haven't been able to do that, the decision was taken that in conformity with this right to protect Kosovo that had been in a certain way set up and implemented at the end of the last century, there was a need today to go along the same path and to decide for independence. Of course, we have to deal with protecting the minority rights of the Serbs in the north of Kosovo, but still the only way to proceed was to go along with independence for Kosovo. And that is certainly a major change in some of our way of thinking in the international world, something that wasn't easy to deal with. To get that through, we have tried for the last 6 months to get an agreement with the Russians and the Serbs on the kind of arrangements we could get for Kosovo, independence on one side, but also taking into account all the support that should be given to the Serbian minority. And it is because we have failed to do that, and after 6 months of negotiations with the Serbs and the Russians, and no solution could be found, that we decided that we couldn't let things as they were. There were only bad solutions, because if we didn't move, it would be the people from Kosovo who would become uneasy with the present situation and would ask for independence and would take it on their own without any kind of consultation. We decided that the proper way to proceed was to see how we could go on with independence, ratifying this independence, each of one individually if we wish to go along with that, and try to avoid by any means any kind of new upsurge of violence. And for the last few days so far, but I touch wood, we have been rather successful. Those are the kind of principles, I suppose, we have to set forth. But that's not the only thing we have to do. I think we have to look about new methods of dealing with the different international crises we have to go through. I'll go through that very quickly, just to let you take conscious of what has been going on in the last few years, and I suppose what will go on in the next few years also, as we're trying to get more and more flexible in the way we're dealing with international crises. Take, for instance, the Kosovo crisis, or even the Iranian crisis, the nuclear issue with regard to Iran. What we have set up in the recent years is a group of like-minded countries that are prepared to work for more or less the whole of the international community to try to find solutions. This is the group of 6 that have been set up with regard to the nuclear issue in Iran. United States, Great Britain, Germany, Russia, China, and France, which is a very special group, nothing to do with the permanent members of the Security Council. We have Germany there. Nothing to do with the countries around in the area. There is no country from the Middle East inside that group. It is a group that has more or less self-appointed himself to go on trying to deal with this issue and try to get a solution, and who has more or less been accepted by the rest of the international community for being a sort of pilot for the whole international community. This is something rather new and something rather interesting. The same thing happened with Kosovo, where there was a group called the Quint Group, a group of 5 European countries, the 3 Germany, Britain, Spain, Italy, France. They have tried to deal with that also, and that were more or less working in the name of the whole European community that has accepted that they would go along. As we went along, special rules were adopted because the countries that were left outside from the countries from the European Union that were left outside said at least we want somebody to be there as a sort of a good face broker. So we brought inside Javier Solana, who is the High Representative for Foreign Policy inside the European Union, and we got the Commission also from time to time, the European Commission inside, so that the whole thing seemed to be accepted by the others, and that there were regularly reports back to the members of the European Union that were left outside. This is an example of the new kind of method we are using. Take, for instance, also the way we're working with the regional institutions, whether it be the European Union that I just talked about, but think about the African Union also. More and more, as we go along with African crisis, we are asking the African Union to be the major contributed in order to try to bring back peace when we have crisis there. Think about Rwanda, think about the Democratic Republic of Congo, think about the Darfur for the time being. When we set up peace forces, we go through the African countries. They are the ones who bring the major contributions. They are the ones who find the kind of honest brokers that try to bring everybody back to the negotiation table. This has happened with South Africa, who has played a major part in those crises in the recent months. It has also to do with Libya, for instance, who has tried to play a major part with Darfur. This is also something rather new, and that wasn't there about 10 years ago. And then a third actor that we try to put more and more into our international actions are, of course, the NGOs. Think about Afghanistan, think about Darfur, think about some other places in Asia. More and more do we have NGOs being at the center of the kind of international action that we try to get through. Third point issue on which I would just like to give you also an example, the new tools that we try to put forward in order to have a more efficient diplomacy. And here, let me just give you 2 or 3 examples and not more. How did we try to get out of some of the major European crises that were looming there after the end of the Berlin Wall? We found this way of setting up more and more association partnership in some of those countries to pave the way for some of them to become members of the European Union, and from others to be only a close partner to the European Union without being totally a member. But through those special partnerships that we have set up, and now we have a whole network of association partnerships with all of those countries, we have managed to diffuse the very difficult issues that were there. Think about at one point the situation between Romania and Hungary. They were just about to start a major conflict because of the minorities that were there on the borders between the two countries. Think about Ukraine, think about Moldavia and other countries. Through this kind of partnership that we have tried to enhance all over the European continent, we have been able to bring back peace, and so far, I must say, to be able to find a peaceful way of going ahead with many of those countries, whether it be Ukraine, whether it be Georgia, with which we're thinking about starting also this kind of partnership, whether it be the Balkan countries, Macedonia, Montenegro, Albania, you name it. Most of them were in a very difficult situation, and we have managed slowly, progressively, to find solution there. Second example, sanctions, the policy of sanctions. And this is maybe a very interesting area that on which you could have for a few seconds a closer watch. As you know, in the nuclear issue with Iran, we have decided to go for the path of sanctions, economic and financial sanctions. This is not an easy path. This has never been an easy path in international life. If you look at Rhodesia in about 30 years ago, if you look at other countries, what we're trying to do with Cuba, etc., quite often sanctions are an instrument that is not very efficient. And if you look at what we have tried to do with Iran, you could say you could more or less have the same assessment. We have gone through 2 resolutions of the Security Council so far, and we're trying to get the adoption of a 3rd one at the moment in the Security Council. And each time those resolutions encompass, I would say, a group of sanctions that are, I would say, less and less powerful. And therefore, those formal sanctions give the impression that they're not very efficient and that in the end they will lead nowhere. But what we have discovered as we went along is that, on the contrary, those formal sanctions have had this great merit of showing, by the way they were adopted in the Security Council, and so far they have always been adopted by consensus and by unanimity, that in fact those sanctions and those resolutions was sending a very good message of international unity against Iran. And while we were doing that on a formal basis, at the same time, in a very informal basis, through the banking institution, through the financial institutions, there we were taking much stricter, much stronger measures that were having a much greater impact on the Iranian economy. So this twofold approach, which is a rather new one, I must say, has been in fact rather effective and much more efficient than we would have thought. Of course, Iran hasn't moved for the time being, and I don't know if it will move for the time being and for a long time, but at least what we're seeing is that this twofold approach with formal sanctions on one side giving a clear impression of international unity, and the other side informal sanctions that show much more efficiency. This has been so far the way we have proceeded, and a rather new way of proceeding that is rather interesting. And I think that could be useful for the future and gives us a new experience there. Those are a few examples. I could go on, and maybe as we go along with the question and answer session, we will see more about what we're trying to do at the moment in the international world. But I think that this tells a lot about the fact that a new kind of diplomacy is in the making and is going on in an ongoing process of restoring a new efficient diplomatic action. And I think this is something very interesting to watch as it goes on. There's still a lot of work to do, of course. And I suppose there's one thing where we have much more work to do with regard to the traditional diplomatic approach, is that this must be an approach that deals much more with what is certainly today one of the major challenges we're facing in the international world, is the speed of this international world. The fact that more and more crises are appearing quickly, disappearing just as quickly, new forms of crisis are coming, new forms of violence, new forms of terrorism, and that if the diplomatic traditional channels want to be efficient and want to cope with those difficult challenges that we're facing, the diplomatic action has to be quicker than it has been so far. Some of the tools I've shown you, some of the methods, some of the principles I have shown you are trying to deal with that new challenge of speed and urgency. They haven't managed to be maybe as efficient as they should be, but this is really the kind of new progress we're trying to face and to implement as we go on. I've been too long, I apologize, but I'm ready to all the questions you want to ask.
Thank you very much. We are going to turn over to questions very soon, and I want to thank you for your speech on diplomacy, which I'm sure fell into very receptive ears here, since many of the students at the Vimont School do go on and work in diplomatic careers. But I will abuse my privilege as chair and ask you the first question, if I may. We've heard a lot about diplomacy. I'd like to push you a little bit further on French diplomacy. I was speaking recently with people working at the State Department, and they mentioned to me that currently they work with France and they need France on virtually every single dossier that they're dealing with. And pardon my cynicisms, but I thought, at least from the US media, that France is only this medium-sized power, which is the power of the past, and why do we need France for everything? So can you elaborate on that a little bit? Give us maybe a few examples.
I think this is maybe due to the fact that it's maybe due to France's arrogance, first of all. But I think an interesting feature that is common to our two countries, yours and France, is that we have this sense of being a universal nation, of having some sort of universal vocation, and that whatever issue appears in the international world, France has the impression that it has to do something about it. Which is something very special when we compare to most of our European partners. Having worked a lot in European affairs, I can tell you that every time we meet in Brussels, now we are 27, at the time when I was there we were 15, but every time we met in Brussels, I was always the one who was coming in saying something's happening, maybe in Burma or one of those places, we have to do something about it. And quite often some of my European counterparts were telling me, why for? This is somewhere very remote in Asia. What do we have to deal with that? Do it if you want, but I don't intend to follow. So I think that one of the reasons why your American interlocutors told you that they wanted, that they needed France, is that we're usually one of the countries that always answer to the call when there is something that has to be done with regard to any kind of international crisis appearing here and there. And just to give you a concrete example of this is that you may know that the two largest diplomatic networks in the world are the American one and the French one. We still have a number of embassies around the world that is quite impressive. I won't tell you the figure because you will be quite surprised. And at the moment, as we are thinking about cutting public spendings in France, this network is under great danger of being reduced. But we have the largest diplomatic and consular network in the world, with the only exception of the Americans, much more than the British, the German, the Italian, or the Spanish diplomatic and consular network.
When diplomacy fails, there are a lot of different reasons to go to war. You cited some humanitarian intervention to defend allies, and more relevant to now, terrorist actions. When we look at the wars that we've been waging in Afghanistan and Iraq. In Afghanistan, after September 11th, we decided that the people who were responsible for the actions were so entrenched in the government that we had no other option but to go to war with the country. And in Iraq, we perceived the threat of terrorist action. In order to prevent that, we also went to war with Iraq. But the difference there in the two different wars and the causation is a reactionary versus a preemptive war. So my question to you is: do you believe that a preventative war is a just war, is cause for creating war? And what's the difference between how America would perceive that and how France would perceive it?
I think you're at the heart of one of the most difficult questions in international affairs, preventive war. I think you can't give. It's very difficult to give a general answer because it very much depends on where your preventive war is going to take place, which kind of country, why are the reasons for that, etc. If you look at Afghanistan, first of all, if you look at the reasons why we went there, it wasn't a preventive war. It was a war that was decided after 9/11, because we got intelligence that showed that the people responsible for the 9/11 were there. The support of the Taliban regime was sort of heaven for terrorists, and it was a clear decision taken by the international community with a legal basis to do that. And that was one typical case where we went there and we decided to go for war because this was the only way to prevent any further action, even if there had been already one action before. And as I was saying before, now we find ourselves facing a problem, is that we've been there for 7 years now, nearly 7 years, 6 or 7 years, and we all feel that we are still there for many years, that we have, by way or another, to decide what kind of strategy we want for that country in order not to be stay there for the next 70 or 80 years. Iraq is something different, because there we had, as you know, differences among ourselves. The resolution passed by the Security Council was a resolution 1441, on which we all agreed, that was dealing mostly with weapons of mass destruction. And we thought there were weapons of mass destruction there. We wanted to check and to see if they were there, and we were all more or less prepared to use force if necessary, if we found weapons there, and the Iraqi regime would not follow suit if we were asking there. What went wrong after that is that some countries decided that without waiting to see whether really there were weapons of mass destructions or not, they were going to go ahead, and others decided that they would not go along, and this is where we've got our differences. But I think that, to answer your question, a preventive war can only be, and this is at least French point of view, a preventive war can only be decided if there is a clear legal basis among the international community, and there is a clear understanding of the kind of purpose for going there, and the kind of clear objective that we are trying to follow. If you take another example, Kosovo, where we decided to go there, this was clearly to go there to protect the Albanese community that was being attacked by the regime from Belgrade, that if we didn't go there, the poor people were in trouble. So that had a lot to do with what has been since considered as a new principle in the international community, the principle of the right for a population to be protected by the international community, which is something rather new that we had set up, and that now we have to reinforce as much as possible.
Just with respect to Afghanistan, and I guess this is on the subject of NATO, not necessarily France, but I guess France's role within NATO, is that a lot of the troops that are sent from Germany and France fight with caveats in their kind of respective regions. And then what does that portend, I guess, for the NATO relationship, in that you have the Canadians, the British, and the Americans fighting without caveats, really kind of going into the Helmand province, for example, versus, say, French and German troops, which are kind of in more protected areas, not doing necessarily the fighting that the American troops or the Canadian troops are doing. What does France kind of see as the role of NATO, and kind of specifically within respect that the role or their mission in Afghanistan?
You're right that when those different countries decided to contribute to have contributions in Afghanistan, a lot of them then came with caveats, had different types of forces that came in, and this has certainly complicated the issue. I think one of the thinking that we must have among all together as we go on trying to define a more global and unified strategy among ourselves will be certainly to try to reach an agreement on on bringing more mobility to those different forces. France is ready to do that. We're quite prepared to do that and to try to think how we can help in the best way, take into account also the fact that French military resources for external operation are not in huge quantity, and as you may not know, at the present moment French military forces are also working in different peace forces, whether it be southern Lebanon, whether it be Bosnia, whether it be Kosovo. We're setting up a new European force where French contribution will amount to more than 50% at the border between Chad and Sudan, with regard to the Darfur refugees. So all this put together makes us one of the major contributors with the United States and Britain, one of the three major contributors of foreign operational forces, and of course this limits a little bit what we would like to do in Afghanistan. But about the need to get more cohesion among the military arrangements in Afghanistan, this is one of the major issues that NATO is discussing at the moment. And as you know, the Afghan issue will be at the priority for the next Bucharest meeting in April, the meeting of the heads of state and government, and there will be decisions taken there at the time.
But does France have a specific, I guess, endgame vision for what it
for our contribution? Yeah.
Yes.
For us, at the moment, we had three, I would say, major contributions. One is in Kabul. We were in charge of security in Kabul. The second one was to help in training teams in different areas of the country. And the third one is some of our aircrafts in Kandahar. And we had a fourth element, which was special forces working with the American forces. Those have come back to France about 1 or 2 years ago, and maybe there is this idea that they maybe could be back again, but we haven't decided yet. But this was a major component of French contribution, and we have to see if we stick to that or if we try to move along and try to go in other areas. This is at the moment being looked at in France, and decision will be taken with the prospect of that meeting in Bucharest in April.
Some analysts would associate certain divisions in the Franco-American relationship with the fact that whereas the United States throughout its not so long history has had just one constitution, France has had quite a few. So I was just wondering if you could comment maybe on some of the advantages that come from having a constitution that actually leaves room for interpretation and further evolution, and maybe how that translates into France's foreign policy today.
I think we have learned the lessons about having too many constitutions that had a lot to do with this great habit of French Revolution. When you're not happy, you go into the streets and you change the constitution. Now we're living with the same constitution since 1958, as you know, and in fact you're right, this constitution has shown great abilities to transform itself, and if we intended to have a rather, as we have gone through those years with a rather pragmatic approach, we have been able slowly, without reforming too much our constitution for many years, to adapt slowly the way of work for the government to work and for the president to work, if just looking at international affairs. One has to admit that diplomatic action in France, or foreign policy, is very much the competence of the President of the Republic, and this has remained so. But where you have seen some evolution is in the way slowly the French Parliament has been able, I wouldn't say to control, not even say to give a word, to say his word, but at least through his committees to be able to get more information about what was going on. And at the moment we're thinking about giving him even more power. And you've seen also with the kind of cohabitation that we've had, between the President of the Republic, who was of one political color, and the government, who at several occasions was of a different political color, they have been able to work together, some sort of a balance in foreign policy between the powers of the President and the powers of the Prime Minister. That has more or less gone all right, in fact. And this has shown that our constitution could leave some room for maneuver, and that has been rather good. And apart from a small group of political leaders who from time to time say that we should change our constitution and go for a sixth republic, I would say that this hasn't gone very well with French public opinion and with most of the political leaders in France who prefer to stick to the constitution and try to see if it can be amended if necessary.
Yes, I have two questions. So that France is trying to solve the national conflict. And what is the French government's position on the continuing conflict
first point, the too long conflict between Israel and Palestinians, French position has more or less been the same for many years now. It's based on a few set of principles, very easy one to remember. Israel has a right to exist and to live in peace and security, but we must also, on the other side, have a Palestinian state that can exist and can live also side by side with Israel, and we must try to find a solution for the different problems that may exist, and that go very much along the lines of what has been tried by the Clinton administration, by this present administration, with the Annapolis process that is going on at the moment. We're supporting the Annapolis process, and we think, as I think Henry Kissinger said at one point, that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is one of the most, it's a very special conflict. It is a conflict of which we know more or less the answers and the solution at the end, but we don't know how to go from here to the solution. Because everybody knows more or less what the solution must be, whether it be the status of Jerusalem, the question of the borders, the question of security, the question of the Palestinian refugees. We all know more or less what the solution would be. The Palestinians know, the Israelis know. But then you need a political will to go ahead and to try to define more precisely those solutions and to get an agreement. And we're still, I must say, far away from that for the time being. So we're trying to help. We had this donors conference in Paris at the end of December that managed to get a lot of money for the Palestinian territories, more than $7.7 billion, and we're trying to help through that channel. We just hope that as discussions go on between Olmert, the Israeli Prime Minister, and the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, they manage little by little to get an agreement on the different issues. To be frank, I think that one has to be realistic about that. The whole process is fraught with many dangers and many challenges. One of the main challenges being the situation in Gaza, as we have seen, and the fact that the Hamas is there and refuses for the time being to get into that political process, and we can't allow that to continue. But they have a nuisance capacity that is there, no doubt about it, and the political process has, by way or another, to take that into account and to see how we can go on. The second point you made about Lebanon, the Lebanese conflict in 2006, I think this was a rather good example of the kind of common work and collaboration we managed to have in the end between the American administration and the French administration. It wasn't easy. We had some difficulties at one point, but we managed together to set up a resolution, 1701, that in the end brought the war to an end. It wasn't perfect, and it's still not perfect. The situation in South Lebanon is always a bit uneasy. Tension is there from time to time. But at least we managed to stop the conflict, to stop the battle as it was going on. I think that was the most important, because there was a real fear that if we hadn't stopped the war as it was going on, then external influence from Syria, from Iran, from other places could have grown and bring the whole thing and the whole crisis to a point of tension that would have been very difficult to bring to a halt. So I think maybe it took 1 month, you're right. It was 1 month too much, but at least we managed in the end to stop it.
You mentioned that
questions. What, in your opinion, are the lessons that French foreign policy has taken, if any at all, from the Arche de Zoé case?
Maybe I'll start by the second point, is that you have to control maybe much more those NGOs and that you have to be very careful with what they're doing. But apart from that, I think that everybody has agreed in France that this Arche de Zoé case, as you say, was a dreadful one, that it should never have happened, that it should never happen again. But definitely from all the inquiry that has been going on so far, it appears very clearly that the responsibles of that, the people responsible into that, inside that association, try by all means to hide what they were doing, and that this was definitely a sort of act that goes under criminal law, and that this is what's going on at the moment. On your first point, of course, the African Union is not perfect. I don't know if there is corruption, but there are rumors about that. There are also not rumors, but accusations that and criticism that it is not efficient enough. But I think that one of the main features that we are finding more and more in the African continent is that the African want to be responsible for their own affairs, and that you can't go on getting into their countries and saying, I'm going to find a solution on your behalf. We can't do it in the same old way as this was being done about 20 or 30 years ago. Now, when a crisis appears in Africa, whether it be in internal crisis or external crisis, African countries want to have their say and the first say in their affairs. If after that they ask for the support of foreign countries, we're quite prepared to come there and help them if they need so. But first of all, we think it's important for them to discuss together. And the African Union has set up different institutions that are helpful, sort of Security Council of their own, a General Secretary, etc., etc. And I think those institutions have to be applied every time necessary. That's the first way to proceed in French opinion. If we don't go through that channel, the worst is to come then.
I think one extremely relevant conflict, especially given the ongoing war on terror, is the French-Algerian conflict. And it kind of, there's very eerie, I guess, similarities between the way the French were fighting the Algerians then and how Americans are dealing with terrorists now in Afghanistan and Iraq. And I was wondering how you felt experience in Algeria might have shaped French policy towards terrorism nowadays, and especially also not only in foreign policy, but in domestic policy, dealing with Muslim immigrants who, as recently as during previous summers, had been involved in several riots and unrest. Do you feel that the French are paralyzed in a sense, perhaps, over perhaps guilt maybe in relating, because many of those immigrants are Algerian? Or do you think that they've learned valuable lessons that will ultimately help effective policy?
I think you need to make a distinction, because Algeria was really about the independence of Algeria. And if the Algerian movements used terrorist acts, they were fighting for their independence. And this seems to me to be quite different, for instance, from a movement like the one like Al-Qaeda, who is not fighting for independence, but fighting for, we don't know exactly what they are, but fighting for the influence of the Muslim world and for the sort of jihad, the saint conquest by this Muslim movement. So I think this is something very different. And of course we may have been wrong during the Algerian War. That this is something for the historians. But at the end, we gave the independence to to Algeria. Those groups came out in the open. Some of them even became the leader, got the leadership of the country. And since then, we have managed, by a way or another, to set up a relationship with them. Talking about the Muslim population in our country, I think this is something very different also. We have something between 4 and 5 million Muslims in our country. Much of them are French citizens, in fact, because they are the children and the grandchildren of immigrants who came to France quite often in the 50s to work as in the manufacturing sector, car manufacturing, aircraft, etc., textile. And they have stayed there, they have brought their family, and those family have grown up. And the questions we have with them, with most of them, is not, in my opinion, a terrorist question. It's mostly a social question. It has a lot to do, let's be frank, about discrimination and the fact that a lot of those people are living in the suburbs of our great city, where housing is in very poor conditions, where your education is not good, where you lack public transports, etc., etc. And you lack employment, of course, and jobs. And this is what it's all about. And most of the governments that have tried to solve that issue haven't succeeded very well. We're trying again. We're putting more money into those suburbs. But it seems to me to be a totally different issue from the terrorist issue. Because if you look at the terrorist issue at the moment in France, you have here and there some problems. But those are usually not always Muslims, first of all. And there are people sometimes living in your everyday life, living in the center of Paris and not in the suburbs. Some of those people we have arrested are living in the center of Paris, mostly working with internet to get the influence and get influenced by this Muslim propaganda. And a little bit as it has happened in Britain, for instance, with those doctors that have done the latest terrorist acts, and they were living a very normal life in their surrounding community. This is the kind of threat we are facing today, and this is really the most difficult terrorist threat we are facing inside our country. And the other one, of course, is outside. I was telling previously in some parts of Africa or elsewhere. But inside France, this is the kind of threat we are facing. And it seems to me to have little to do with the question of the suburbs.
Hi. I remember when President Sarkozy was elected, he mentioned the idea of a Mediterranean Union. I was wondering if you could perhaps expand a little bit on that idea, and if anything has been done since then to sort of bring that forward.
Yes, we're trying to go ahead with that. I suppose the problem with Mediterranean Union is a problem you find quite often with French diplomacy, is that we like to use grand concepts, and grand theories, and we throw that in the open, and some of our partners get frightened. And this is what has happened with the Mediterranean Union. And most of our European partners got the impression that we were trying to get rid of what has been done so far for the last 10 or 15 years that you may have heard about, which is called the Barcelona process, which is a program that has been set up by all the members of the European Union, where we have put a lot of money and we have tried to push forwards projects in the different fields, economic, social, cultural field. The truth, and we all agree on that, is that this Barcelona process hasn't been very successful. The countries that have benefited from the Mediterranean countries that may have benefited from that program have the impression that a lot of money is being poured into those programs without great efficiency. And this is why France has started to think about what could we do to improve the cooperation that we want to have with the Mediterranean countries, and how could we do it? So we came out with this idea of Mediterranean Union, which is a rather simple idea, which goes on saying that let's try to select 4 or 5 themes which are the most important one at the present moment, and let's try to work in a very concrete way. The theme of immigration, the theme, for instance, of environment, question about energy also, for instance, and let's pick up 4 or 5 of those themes and try to see together, the countries on each side of the Mediterranean, how we can deal with that. And as we went along and explained that to our partners, they have better understood trying to say and have agreed to that. We want to launch that initiatives at the beginning of July, because we're going to have the European presidency as of the 1st of July. So there will be a big two meetings. You'll have 2 meetings for the price of one in Paris on the 13th and the 14th of July. You have a first meeting that will gather only the countries on both sides of the countries that border the Mediterranean, which means that for the European Union you will only have 6 or 7 countries, and the other day you will have all the members of the European Union, the 27, that will be there with the Mediterranean countries. The idea that being that nobody is excluded, all those who want to get into that union are welcome, if they want to work on those issues, very concrete issues, and to try to set up some interesting projects on which we could work.
The European negotiators in Kosovo offered to allow the areas where the Serbian majority to remain in Serbia. Now that Kosovo has got its independence, what do you say to removing the assumption that they also?
The idea was not exactly to allow the Serbians who are in the north of Kosovo to retain a common territory with Serbia. What we want to have is a Kosovo, an independent Kosovo inside the territorial limits that are there at the present moment. Because what we want to avoid at any cost is once again to go along this line that has been pushed time and again by, sometimes by the Serbs, which is to have pure from an ethnical point of view, pure nations. In other words, to have a Kosovo that will only have an Albanian population, and then to have a Serbia with all the Serbs all around. And this is certainly not what we're looking for. What we're looking for is a mixed Kosovo, where you will have a majority of Albanian origin and also a minority of Serbian origin. And what we want is for the Serbians to have all the rights of a minority being protected according to the Kosovo constitution when it will be set up, and to have all the rights of a minority that will be protected thanks to the Kosovo constitution. And this is what we're looking for. And we want to prevent any kind of partition that could appear in the near future in Kosovo. This we want to avoid at any cost. In fact, what we're looking for is for the implementation of the Ahtisaari report that, as you know, came out last year at the beginning of 2007, that was discussed in the Security Council, on which a huge majority of the Security Council members could accept, but that was refused by the Russians mostly and by the Serbs, but they're not member of the Security Council. Those two have refused to go along and to accept that idea of an independent Kosovo with special protection for the Serb minority. So we're going along and implementing the Ahtisaari report, and we hope that as we go along slowly, everybody will accept that, and that we will bring peace again in Kosovo.
We have time for one last question. So many hands up, but one last question. Yes.
So yesterday, Princeton's very own Wolfgang Donovan, who's a person in my favorite professor, was quoted as saying that Kosovo's declaration of independence was a major triumph, major victory for self-determination worldwide. Whereas today, you have Serbia's young Foreign Minister Vukjević saying that it's essentially a toolkit for illegal separatist movements worldwide. Going forward, where does the international community, how does the international community distinguish between illegal separatist campaigns and legitimate efforts towards self-determination? And secondly,
what do you foresee to be France's role in reconciling a seemingly fragmented European Union foreign policy, with specifically Spain, Romania, Slovakia, Cyprus, disagreeing with decisions to recognize it? How do you do that, especially in light of whether Russia fulfills its threats or commitments, whichever way you look at it, to recognize Abkhazia and South Ossetia?
We have tried, we're not the only ones, but speaking for France, what we have tried is to take Kosovo as a special case because of the way all this happened in 1999. So we have decided, first of all, that this is a special case that must be treated as such and managed in a particular way. That's why the United Nations took over, in fact, the country and ruled the country for several years. And the second point was that to find a way out of the situation, we precisely decided also that we would do it in a particular way, having asked for this report by Ahtisaari, and trying after that, and this is an idea we put forward, as we've seen in June, that Russians and Serbs didn't agree with the Ahtisaari report. We asked for 6 more months to try to find an agreement with Russia and Serbia. So we set up a special group of 3 with Russians, a Russian representative, an American representative, and a European representative. And this group has worked for the last 6 months trying to find compromises and throwing out the fact the European representative, Wolfgang Ischinger, came out with half a dozen proposals for compromise that were rather good ones, very interesting ones. And each time the Russians and the Serbs said, no, we don't want it. We just refuse. We want the status quo to go on forever. And we said this cannot go on because then we're going to have real problems with the Kosovar population. They won't accept that, and they will just decide unilaterally for independence. So what has been decided in the end, and this has been treated once again as a special case, was that we would sort of manage in a concerted way the independence, the way Kosovo will gain its independence. In other words, we said you will declare your independence and we will recognize you immediately. So we have considered this as an ad hoc case, something that cannot be imitated, that is something special, that is still based upon resolution 1244, and that is in accordance with what had been decided by the Security Council with that resolution in 1944. I must, to be frank and to be honest with you, must say that this is, to me, at the fringe of the international legal system. But if it can allow to find a way through, and in the end, if we can find a way of working in a peaceful way with Serbia on one side, Kosovo on the other side, that will be, after all, a good solution. There was no good solution in Kosovo. There was only try to find the least difficult, the one that would be the least difficult and the least dangerous, and this is the course we have decided to go on. We keep very close contacts with the Serbian authorities. We're discussing with them every day. They have remained rather responsible, the Russians also, and from what we understand, going back to the heart of your question, the Russians don't want to accept Kosovo as a precedent that will serve for other cases. In fact, Putin has gone public in the last few days, as you know, in his last press conference. You could find that very easily. He said something like, "It's not because the other ones are making mistakes that I should do mistakes also." It seems to be a rather responsible attitude. So we hope it will. Russia will stick to that position.
Well, unfortunately, we have to break off now, but there's still so many hands up that I guess the only thing it means is you'll have to come to Princeton the second time.
Poor you will have to bear me.